Hello! My name is Rinon, and a little while ago I released a video where honestly I just rambled about healing in Heavensward. I talked a little bit about the jobs, I talked a little bit about the way the structure of healing in Heavensward was different than the way that it is structured now, and today I want to do that again, but this time for Stormblood. I have got together some old footage of myself playing White Mage in Deltascape V3 Savage, which is the first raid tier in Stormblood, and I want to talk about the way that healing evolved going from Heavensward through to Stormblood, and the way that Stormblood healing is such a different beast than healing is today in Final Fantasy XIV. I think that it will be quite a good idea to take a step back before we go into Dawn Trail. We're about to take another big step forward. We might see big changes on the whole for healers next expansion. I'm not really expecting it, but it's a possibility. But if you watch the Heavensward video and this one back to back, you can see how different healing can be from expansion to expansion. Okay, let's get into it. So before I play the video itself, I want to talk a little bit about the way that White Mage changed. Going from Heavensward to Stormblood, there was a big overhaul for healers. Firstly, the paradigm of cleric stance dancing in order to heal and deal damage was removed. It was considered by the developers to be extremely clunky to execute, and to a large extent I honestly agree with that, so they removed cleric stance entirely. This is also where they started a push towards adding job gauges to jobs. It was Shadowbringers when we saw across the board every job got a job gauge, but in Stormblood, the job that I'm showing here, White Mage, actually got a kind of pseudo job gauge, but it is very different than the Lily gauge you may be used to now. So at level 52 you got a trait called Secret of the Lily. This trait got changed a million times in Stormblood. It was honestly a completely broken ability. In this Stormblood media tour and leading up to launch, the tooltip read as follows. It grants a 20% chance that a Lily is added to your healing gauge upon the execution of Cure or Cure 2. Lilies will lower the recast time for Asylum, Assize, Benison, or Tetra by a percentage corresponding to the number of lilies stacked at the time of action execution. So essentially, the way that lilies actually worked back then, you had no access to a Flatus abilities to spend the lilies. They did not passively generate. You had to actively generate these lilies by using your healing skills, your healing spells, GCD heals. And what they would do is they would stack up, and when you pressed an off-global heal or DPS ability in the case of Assize, it would give you cooldown reduction on that ability. That's really weird, right? Especially when you consider jobs nowadays, that's such a weird interaction. This ability got changed a lot. They changed it initially, they upgraded the percentage that you would proc a Lily from a GCD heal. They changed it to 50% at one point, they eventually changed it to 100% as well. There was another really weird ability as well, which you will recognize today, which is Plenary Indulgence. Now this ability worked very differently to how it is now. The original tooltip for Plenary Indulgence read as follows. Restores HP of all nearby party members. Potency varies with current confession stat. There is a 20% chance that your party members are granted a confession every time you heal via Cure or Cure 2. Okay, so basically this was stupid, let's be real. The way that this actually worked was that whenever you did a Cure or a Cure 2, the party members would gain a confession stack, right? And then you could proc the confession stacks for a heal on them. That's the way that it worked. This also very quickly changed from the media tour and early access and the launch to going into Stormblood. What they eventually changed it to fairly quickly was party members will no longer be granted a confession when HP is restored via Cure and Cure 2. They will instead be granted a confession stack when HP is restored via Medica, Medica 2 or Cure 3, so your AoE GCD heals. By the time the first raid tier came out, this was how it worked, because the way it worked before, it was essentially pointless, right? You didn't care about the ability. The chance of granting party members a confession stack has been increased from 20% to 100%, because, my lord, it was pointless enough with Cure and Cure 2 as it was. That made it unusable. The duration of the confession has been reduced from 30 to 10 seconds. Healing potency based on the number of stacks of confession has been reduced from 4. Okay, basically the new potencies where if you had 1 stack on the raid, you could heal them for 150 potency. 2 stacks it was 300, and 3 stacks it was 450. And it was a 60-second cooldown. The way that this actually worked in Stormblood was essentially you'd do a GCD heal, a Medica 2, or a Cure 3, and then you could buff the heal by just boosting out that second heal immediately as an off-global, right? That was the way that you used it. Because it only had a 10-second timer, it would drop almost immediately, so the uses for actually gaining value from that heal, aside from just pressing it after a GCD, was super limited. But I can tell you one example in the first raid tier of Stormblood where it was useful, which was the final Enrage of Neo X-Death. You could heal 1 stack of damage. The boss pounds the floor repeatedly, and it's damage, then damage, then damage repeatedly, right? So you could heal 1 stack, and then you could wait 5 or 6 seconds to take the damage from another hit, and then you could hit your confessions, heal them back up again, and you would gain value from repeated multiple raid damages in that way, right? So White Mage's job gauge was very different. They still had cleric stance in the game, but instead of it being a stance, it was instead just a damage cooldown. It gave you a 5% buff, it lasted 50 seconds, it was a 90-second cooldown. You also got Thin Air in Stormblood, which was the best iteration of Thin Air ever, because Thin Air in Stormblood was it lasted 12 seconds, it was a 2-minute cooldown, and while it was up, all of your spells were free. Everything was free. It wasn't single use, it was just a cooldown that lasted a duration and made everything free during it. And I'm sure that just as much as I loved it at the time, you can see how that might be incredibly useful in prog scenarios. You can use it for reses, you can use it for bursts of healing, you can use it to fix your mana economy after you've just resed, you can use it for all kinds of applications. You would also have access to Divine Benison. It was added, it was a 60-second cooldown, you could only have 1 stack of it at the time. It gave you a 15% shield on whoever your target was, and it would eat all of your lilies to reduce its recast timer, as we talked about before. Those were a lot of the key changes that happened to White Mage. So you can tell how this job that we talked about in Heavensward changed a lot. They lost a lot of skills. If we look at the hotbars now, you see that we now only have 2 dots. We no longer have 3. We have a casted dot and we have an instant dot. You can just see all of the gaps here. If we look down at the hotbars, there's a million gaps where all of these abilities used to be, like Aero 1 used to be, like the lower stones used to be, like Fluid Aura used to be. There are all of these gaps where these abilities used to exist and they just gutted them. They gutted so many jobs in Stormblood. They removed so much button bloat. Okay, so let's watch the video and we'll talk about it a little bit. One thing to notice here, you can see down on the healing hotbar I have this ability, which I believe this expansion was called Largesse, I can't quite remember. It was an off-global ability, you press that and it will vamp and buff your heals during the duration, your GCD heals specifically, the same way that Temperance buffs your GCD heals right now. So you had a dedicated button specifically for that. You can also see that, on the whole, so many buttons, especially in the DPS sector, the DPS suite of abilities have been removed. And on White Mage, you can also see specifically right there on the hotbar right now, you can see that Eye for an Eye still exists. This was, let me just talk about it and pause the video for a moment. This was an expansion that was peak team play, mitigative, and assistance interactions between jobs. What I'm trying to say with that is that almost every job in the game had 1 or 2 abilities that would help with the team's mitigation, but they also had 1 or 2 abilities that would help with very specific scenarios or with helping other players. So as an example, casters had access to Mana Shift, which was an off-global that they could press that would just, it would leech, say like 2 to 3k of their MP, and it would give it to the targeted player. So let's say that a healer has just died and rezzed. The caster could mana shift them and give them the MP to allow them to get back into the encounter quickly. They also had APOC, which was a mitigation they could put on the tank. They still had Addle, which they could put on the raid as well. Very, very useful, very, very helpful. Obviously, Eye for an Eye is something we talked about in the previous video. It still exists. The tooltip changed very slightly, if I remember rightly, and it became a cross-roll skill. But the general aim and the general capabilities of that ability remained the same. Everybody had things that they could use to help other people. And I think that actually this is something that I kind of wish FF14 retained a bit. Skills like Mana Shift were so cool and useful, and I kind of wish that they came back in some way. Another thing that a lot of jobs had, including healers, healers specifically had this ability that I think was called Break, right? And what Break is it was a DPS GCD ability that cost 0 MP and did less damage than everything else. So, if you had just come off a res and you had no MP, or if you had a big healing check coming up and you weren't sure if you were going to be able to deal with it, you had this skill that you could press as a filler that would allow you to contribute to the raid's DPS with no risk of you running out of MP or endangering others. And I think, if I remember rightly, I think Caster had something similar as well. I'm trying to remember exactly what the tooltip was. Maybe I'll bring it up on the screen right now so you can see what the tooltip was that Caster had. They had something fairly similar. Okay, let's carry on. I will say, I really missed Deltascape. This fight was so good. If you haven't done Halicarnassus min-eye level, you absolutely should. It was such a good experience. You can see Shadow Flare on the floor. That was something that remained for casters. That was something that remained for Scholar. But it wasn't something that you kept uptime of. It was just a 60-second cooldown that you just used. You just pressed the button, it went down, and when it came back off cooldown, you'd press it again. That was it. And you can see that White Mage's damaging suite here is a casted AoE dot in arrow 3, an instant dot in arrow 2, and then you stone as the filler, and you have Assay's as well, you have Holy for AoE. It's really, really simplified down here, almost to the extent that we have today, but not quite. You can see there I just built my confession stacks and then I burnt them immediately, which was kind of the way that you had to use them, just in order to vamp the heal, because it was just very limited use, honestly. I remember this White Flame hit like a truck. This White Flame week 1 was scary. I think this run in particular is like... This was an evening group, like a chill evening group. I think this was either evening 2 or evening 3. I think it was evening 2. I think. So this was like a day 2 clear. I think we unfortunately just missed out on killing this raid tier week 1. We killed it like the reset day, so we killed it day 8 instead of day 7, I suppose. We killed it on the Tuesday that the weeklies reset. It was very unfortunate. We had like a 1% wipe or something on week 1. So this tier hurt at the time. We felt bad about it because we were like so excited to get a week 1, but alas, it all went to shit. So there you go. You see Eye for an Eye here. The Eye for an Eye is going on the tank. And when the tank takes an auto attack, the Eye for an Eye is going to go on the... Does it go on the boss still? Yeah, it does go on the boss, right? But yeah, basically the Eye for an Eye goes on the tank here in order to help mitigate them. I feel like Stormblood was a really good expansion in terms of gameplay. As much as I am a fanboy for Heavensward, I feel like on the whole... Stormblood was the best expansion in terms of job design that also catered to the gameplay style that Square Enix is clearly aiming for. I feel like if Square Enix were to learn any lessons, most of those lessons would be in their Stormblood job design, where they cut a lot of the really clunky things, like say in healers, for specific example. Healers had Cleric Stance in Heavensward, and it was really clunky and quite unfun. But in Stormblood, they had Cleric Stance as a DPS vamp, which was just a skill that you pressed. They had simplified rotations, but they all had something extra to manage for the most part. So Scholar had their Miasma 2 management that was interesting, and they had like 2 dots. White Mage had 2 dots as well. They all had something a little bit more complex than what they have now. The 2 dots had different timers here as well. It wasn't very complex. It was still easy to play. But the job suites in terms of damage on healers were a little bit more interesting than they were now. But if you see the way that I'm actually healing, in general, because you don't have access to Lily heals this expansion, it's very similar to the way that you kind of had to heal in Heavensward. You had to rely very heavily on your GCD healing. Oh my god, look at the size of Asylum. I forgot they changed that. It's really jarring to me to see the way that Asylum used to be when you look at how they are now and how easy they are to apply now. Here you had to be quite precise with how you placed them. But yeah, healers, specifically White Mage as well, would rely very, very heavily on their GCD healing. You didn't have something built into your job gauge like you do right now to give you like free healing. So when damage came out, you were normally thinking, rather than do I have to sacrifice any DPS, it was what do I have to sacrifice? Well, we had a bit of an unfortunate event here. I think our tank wasn't quite supposed to run away. But I think this is a clear, so we clearly get through it. See, we managed to get through this raid damage just about. This was definitely not a clean kill. You didn't need a clean kill in Deltascape, aside from maybe on P4. Protect still existed. You see I'm casting Protect. But if I remember rightly, Stone Skin was gone here. There was no Stone Skinning. You only had to Protect. So one of those pre-pull buffs that took a lot of time and was kind of unfun to use, that was gone. You only had Protect. You see here as well, if you look on the party list, you see this. This is a Mana Song cooldown. I think it's called Refresh. And it was just a cooldown that ranged could press. And they had Tactician as well, which would give you TP. This was also their aggro cut, interestingly enough. These jobs had aggro cuts in order to, because aggro was an issue back then that you had to contend with. All players had to manage their aggro. For healers, Lucid Dreaming was their aggro cut. And ranged worked a little bit differently to the others because the other jobs had something, the other DPS jobs had something that would reduce their active aggro for the next buttons they would press. So you're about to burst, you press the button, reduces your aggro, everything's sorted, right? But range didn't have that. Instead, they had something that would cut their aggro in half. So the way that openers used to work in Stormblood is a bard or machinist would do their opener and they'd be very close on aggro. Maybe they'd be about to take aggro and then they'd hit, say, their tactician and they would cut their aggro in half right at the end of their opener. So they had to use that cooldown to manage that aggro at the same time as they were using it to manage and supply group resources, which was quite interesting. I like this mechanic as well. My group didn't really know how to do this mechanic properly when we cleared. You can see by how much damage we're taking and people dying. So we just kind of did it semi-correctly and hopes and prayed, and it kind of worked out. But yeah, you see the confession stacks coming up here again. There's like not much to use these confession stacks on. I wouldn't be surprised if I let them drop, honestly. Yeah, see, there you go. There's the confession stacks dropping. And the protect's going up post-death, as you have to. I do think on the whole, if we look to White Mage's design here and then we look forward, I think that the Lily system we currently have is a massive improvement over this mess of a Lily system that we had in Stormblood. But the filler skills that White Mage is using in between for their DPS, I really think that we could use having a casted dot with a different duration to Dia coming back. We could really use that. I think that would be very helpful. Also, abilities like Eye for an Eye, things like that. Abilities like Lucid Dreaming. Something that has you actively thinking about something that doesn't directly affect your DPS or your healing, but instead might help the raid out in some way. It's an interaction that I think is interesting on the whole, and also doesn't massively increase the skill floor of the game, right? Because one of the big issues that FF14 had in the past, which is why they've dumbed down a lot of the jobs so much, is that it had a very high skill floor. It was difficult to get into. The skill ceiling of the game has only really gone down a little bit, maybe even not at all, actually. But the skill floor of the game has gone down massively. And I think that keeping the skill floor low whilst having something intermediary for higher level players to think about that helps the raid is only a good thing. This fight has a lot of repeats watching it back. This fight is very fun, but it does have a lot of repeats. There are... You can tell where FF14's obsession with repeated mechanics on third floors originated from, because there's a lot of repeated mechanics here. I would also say that this is definitely not optimal gameplay. This is like day 2 gameplay. I'm not a super high level player here. I'm definitely a lot better than in the Heavensward video, but I'm not the best. I'm just okay here. You can also see that we do not have half casts like you do now. You have full GCD stone casts, which, if I was playing optimally, would mean that my movement is something that I need to really contend with in order to keep uptime, but I'm playing so unoptimally that it looks like it's not a problem, but that's because I'm just dropping GCDs left, right, and center, unfortunately. I remember that, in particular, this isn't healer specific. One job I want to talk about the introduction of actually broke this tier was Red Mage, because this tier was not tuned super highly in terms of damage checks ever, and there were not many body checks either. And specifically, Red Mage absolutely broke this tier because, like, world progression groups, including World First, they specifically spoke about how they brought Red Mage into progression. And I think they said that they saw the mechanic that happened around like 60% into the boss fight for the first time. And they just res cheesed their way through to Enrage immediately. They saw like half the fight of progression in one pull, just because Red Mage was so strong in terms of giving the healers MP, in terms of chain resing, that between the three of them, they could just keep getting the raid up again and again and again, and see Enrage immediately, and then be able to clear the fight much quicker. I actually think that Red Mage is the reason that body checks have started being implemented more and more and more and more as time goes on. Got another dimensional wave here even, bloody hell, which is a raid damage. The raid damages don't hit absurdly hard. This fight is approaching the end here. There's not too much else going on. There's like some ins and outs, and there'll probably be another raid damage, something like that. Don't think we see the Enrage cast. Maybe we do, but I don't remember ever seeing the Enrage cast on this fight, I don't think. This is it. The playing field is what the Enrage is, but there's a bit of setup time. So you see here, this is an impossible variant of the game. Maybe we did get closer to Enrage than I thought. Yeah, this is an impossible variant of the game that will just end up killing you. So there we go, she died. But yeah, so this is the way that healing felt in Stormblood, and you can tell how different it was from Heavensward. I'm not going to do a video going into, say, Shadowbringers or anything like that. I feel like Shadowbringers is a bit too recent, but I hope that this gave you a bit of an idea of how much one job can change going from one expansion to the next. And coming into Dawntrail, we can expect that there will be at least a couple of jobs that undergo this level of metamorphosis. We know that Astro is getting big changes next expansion. We know that Dragoon is too. Other jobs might get changes to smaller degrees, but still a decent amount. So yeah, I hope you're looking forward to it. I am too. Thank you so much for watching, friends. I will see you soon. Have a fantastic rest of your days. Really appreciate it. Have a good one. If you've got any Stormblood memories, I'd love to see them in the comments, because I'm honestly just reminiscing in this video. So yeah, have a good one, friends. Bye.